very warm welcome to all of you. We start now. Good evening, India. Good morning, America. Good afternoon, London, elsewhere. I'm so happy that people from all across time zones, from different geographies, are participating in this very important and timely discussion on the mutating world order, which is reflected in this shift or perceived shift from G7 to G11 sort of grouping. Ladies and gentlemen, it's enormously uplifting to see so many familiar faces in the audience. Friends who have found time to be with us. It's not possible to mention all of them, but let me identify some people. Denmark's ambassador to India, Vietnam's ambassador to India, Raja Mohan is joining from Singapore, many ambassadors, diplomats. Each person is special in his own way, so it wouldn't be fair to single out some people. A very warm welcome to all of you. My name is Manish Chand. I am founder and CEO of India Rights Network, an emerging think tank and media publishing platform focused on international affairs, the India story. We also publish India and the World, a magazine journal focused on international relations, which has carved its own niche among the strategic community of India. The Global Insights India TGII is a research arm of our organization and focuses on issues relating to Indo-Pacific, China, and emerging powers. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, let me welcome and introduce our outstanding speakers today briefly. They include some of our best minds, iconic names working in interlinked areas of diplomacy and strategic thinking. It's our special honor to host His Excellency, the Honorable O Farrell, Australia's High Commissioner to India. Welcome, Excellency.
Thank you.
Ambassador Kanwal Sibal, former Foreign Secretary of India, India's former ambassador to France, Russia, Turkey, and Egypt. Ambassador Richard Verma, Vice-Chair and Partner, the Asia Group, and former US Ambassador to India. Ambassador Anil Wadhwa, India's former ambassador, Italy, Thailand, Oman, and Poland, and former Secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs. And of course, Gautam Bambawale, India's former ambassador, China, Pakistan, and Bhutan. I will introduce them in detail when I ask them to speak. Ladies and gentlemen, now let me unpack the overarching theme of this webinar, lay the table as it were. We are meeting at a time of unprecedented crisis and geopolitical churn triggered by a rampaging pandemic that has killed near 1 million people and affected over 10 million people around the world. This virus is brutally egalitarian and is no respecter of national borders. It has also blurred the hierarchy of rich and poor nations. It's become a 3D world marked by death, despair, and devastation. In this 3D world, the only certainty is uncertainty. It's time to replace these 3Ds with 3Rs: reappraisal, rebuilding, and resurgence. This is what this webinar is all about: reappraisal, rebuilding, resurgence, where we are going, where we ought to be going. The theme of the seminar, from G7 to G11, Unscrambling Post-COVID Geopolitical Alphabet, is therefore appropriate and could be seen as a metaphor for a changing world order. Let me give you some background to this debate. On May 31, US President Donald Trump, in his vintage maverick style, responded to a growing impatience with the existing order of things by terming the G7 as a very outdated group, and proposed that the G7 be expanded to include India, Australia, South Korea, and Russia in the grouping of the largest advanced economies. In a conversation with journalists aboard his special aircraft, Air Force One, President Trump suggested that the G7 should be expanded and rechrist as G10 or G11 and proposed that the grouping holds an in-person meeting of leaders in September or November in the US this year. 2 days later, responding to President Trump's G1 proposal in a telephonic conversation on June 2nd, India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi commended him, I quote, for his creative and far-sighted approach, acknowledging the fact that such an expanded forum would be in keeping with the emerging reality of the post-COVID world. Mr. Modi underlined that India would be happy to work with the United States and other countries to ensure the success of the proposed summit. All new invitees to G11, which sound almost like a cricket team, have welcomed the G10, G11 concept. Those who are termed outdated by President Trump are predictably peeved and have resented it. In many ways, the current G7, as argued by President Trump, looks like an anachronism, as they now account for less than a third of global GDP on a purchasing power parity basis and less than half on market exchange rates basis, according to the 2007 report of the accountancy firm Pricewaterhouse. The G7 countries, when constituted, accounted for close to 2/3 of global GDP. The 7 largest economies, E7 or emerging 7, comprising Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, Mexico, Russia, and Turkey, by contrast, account for over a third of global GDP on PPP terms and over a quarter on MER basis. The G10 or 11 proposal has predictably generated intense debate in strategic academic circles about the rationality and viability of the new grouping, which is still an idea in progress. Today, this webinar, we ought to be asking ourselves, is G10-11 an opportunity to recast the world order and create a new multilateral body that can effectively address crises and challenges of the post-COVID world? Hopefully, this webinar will illuminate and clarify complex issues that underpin the idea of G10-11 and how such a grouping, if it comes to fruition, can be shaped to address emergent challenges of the post-COVID world. Ladies and gentlemen, the idea of changing the world...
In the shelf below, that color thing. Yeah.
Is that okay? The idea of changing the world or the world order is a romantic, poetic, and revolutionary idea. We don't know how this geopolitical alphabet will be scrambled and unscrambled to create a new form, an idiom of a new world order. Let me end my opening remarks with the much-cited quatrain of Omar Khayyam in Rubaya. He says, "Our love, could thou and I with fate conspire to grasp this sorry scheme of things entire, would not we shatter it to bits and then remold it nearer to the heart's desire?" Can we create a world which is more in sync with the heart and not just the mind? This is important to bear in mind because it may sound like an emotional sort of spin, but we need to create a world with the heart. Ladies and gentlemen, now it's my pleasure to invite Australia's High Commissioner to India, the Right Honourable Barry O. Farrell. Let me introduce him briefly. He is Australia's High Commissioner to India. Before, he served in the Parliament of New South Wales from 1995 to 2015, including as the state's 43rd Premier between 2011 and 2014. For those who do not know, Australia's most populous and multicultural state, New South Wales, generates a third of the nation's gross domestic product. As Premier, Mr. O Farrell initiated and led annual trade missions to India to promote economic, cultural, and social links between New South Wales and the states of India. High Commissioner loves cricket, and he was, and he bats for India. He's a strong believer in India's destiny. If I go on speaking about the High Commission, each of our speakers, we end up taking a lot of time. So, High Commissioner, I now turn to you. Let me just explain very briefly housekeeping rules the way as we go along. Essentially, each speaker, I'm going to be posing a set of interlinked questions, or maybe two questions, and they are to respond in 5 to 7 minutes at the most, because there'll be, and we hope to complete this opening round, say in 45 minutes, which will be followed by a freewheeling discussion. I already see quite a few questions coming from the audience, people who have sent me on email and otherwise, and people are just joining in. So I start with His Excellency, High Commissioner of Australia. Excellency, you love cricket. It appears to a lot of people that G7, this move from G7 to G11 or G11 is a kind of Trump's googly or a kind of Trump spin, to counter, we're talking about, or to create, or to perpetuate Pax Americana as a counter to Pax Sinica. I mean, there are a lot of speculation about what is the motivation behind G11 idea. I would request you to speak about how Australia looks at it. What is in it for Australia in this G11 idea? In what way it can promote Australia's vital interest, and also how it can open new pathways of cooperation between kindred democracies like Australia and India. Over to you, Excellency.
Thanks, Manish, for that introduction. It's a real pleasure to be part of such a distinguished panel. And as I'm opening the batting, I thought it best I'd play a Virender Sehwag or Dave Warner style innings, short but hopefully sweet, and allow the middle order to build that big score that everyone's looking for. Before we get started, can I make the point that the concept of an expanded G7 is still very much an idea under discussion and being debated in capitals all around the world, including in Canberra. So the thoughts I put forward today are mine and shouldn't be seen as formal Australian government policy. However, I'm confident that the broad thrust of my comments represent the guiding foreign policy principles and priorities of the Australian government. So to your question, Manish, the starting point is an uncontroversial one. Yes, Australia is very supportive of the concept of an expanded G7. As you all know, the G7 has evolved over time, and we should remember its broad original purpose when the G6 first formed in the mid-1970s as a forum of like-minded, free market democracies coordinating and navigating, or at least trying to, the disruptions caused by the OPEC oil embargo and associated economic shocks. The G7 has grown and shrunk and evolved over the past 45 years. But at its heart, the organising principle of influential, like-minded free market democracies coordinating and cooperating to manage global shocks and change remains sound. As we consider the defining trend of this century, the migration of wealth and power from the Atlantic to the Indo-Pacific, it makes eminent sense to me that the G7 be expanded to include more representatives from the region. And I think India, Australia and South Korea, in joining our good friends from Japan, would make the grouping more relevant to the modern world. The other core reason Australia supports the concept of an expanded G7 is we need now more than ever to energise and coordinate our efforts to defend the global liberal order. We've seen in recent weeks the perils that come from creeping authoritarianism and right-is-might politics. And as my foreign minister described in a landmark speech recently, Australians are strong supporters of multilateralism and of an international system shaped by rules and accepted norms, underpinned by consensus-based politics and democratic values. We, like most member countries being identified as potential new members of the G7, most notably India, oppose the notion of international order characterised by hierarchy and coercion. And as Prime Minister Modi said to Prime Minister Morrison during their virtual summit last month, protecting our shared democratic tradition is, quote, a sacred duty. Building our resilience to the efforts of others to coerce and bully us is a major priority for the Australian government. Yesterday, Prime Minister Morrison announced a major boost to our defence capability allocating $270 billion to fortify our capacity to deter aggressors and, for the first time, equip us with long-range hypersonic land, sea and air-based strike capabilities. This came a day after the Defence Minister unveiled a major expansion in our cyber security capabilities, with the government to spend an additional $1.35 billion on building cyber resilience and recruiting another 500 new cyber experts. This shared interest in protecting an open, rules-based international system is also a key feature of the modern Australia-India relationship. And as some of you know, in the virtual summit referred to earlier, both governments took historic steps to upgrade our relationship to the level of a comprehensive strategic partnership, accompanied by 8 high-level agreements in areas of shared interest, including cyber and critical technology, critical minerals, maritime security, and defence coordination. Now, cyber and critical technologies was a major focus, with Australia and India as like-minded democracies recognising the need to work together on an open, free, safe and secure internet, enhance digital trade, harness critical technology opportunities and address cybersecurity challenges. Technologies such as artificial intelligence, quantum computing and robotics present significant opportunities for people, for businesses and the broader economy, but must also be guided by international standards to ensure they don't present risks to security, liberty or prosperity. Australia welcomes its partnership with India on emerging technologies which present both challenges and opportunities, and we recognise these are matters all states must grapple with. Australia, for its part, decided to restrict participation in our 5G network to prevent or to protect our sovereignty and avoid any risk of coercion. It's welcome that these issues are being explored and debated in democracies all around the world. Beyond technology, I'd observed that one of the key themes discussed during the recent summit was the emerging post-COVID shape of the Indo-Pacific and the international multilateral system more broadly. Prime Minister Morrison took the opportunity to acknowledge and congratulate Prime Minister Modi for his leadership, first in his own region through convening a SAARC leaders meeting, and more globally by his calling for the strengthening of the World Health Organization. And what I think is clear is Australia's wish to work more closely with India in shaping the multilateral system, including through any involvement in what might be an expanded G11. And I think there are 3 areas where Australia could work closely with India. The first is making multilateral institutions more fit for purpose. Australia has welcomed India's strong leadership through the COVID crisis in advocating for the role of the G20 as an early and strong proponent of WHO reform. We look forward to working closely with Harsh Vadam as the chair of the organisation's executive board. The second is ensuring these institutions evolve to be more representative. Voices like that of India need more prominence. And that's why Australia is a strong supporter of India becoming a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council and joining the Nuclear Suppliers Group. And the third is in backing India's own new international institutions. Australia has been an early supporter and is an ongoing member of the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure and the International Solar Alliance. So it's vital that like-minded democracies uphold the fundamental democratic values in the multilateral system and work together, including through the Quad, an expanded G7 and other ad hoc multilateral groupings. This will be, in my view, the fundamental organising principle that will bind and deepen the Australia-India partnership into the 21st century. And as I've said elsewhere, Manish, this new and exciting phase of the Australian-India relationship is best described as being characterised by the 4 Ds: democracy, defence, diaspora, where 1 in 50 Australians are of Indian origin, and DOSTI, what we Australians call mateship, but with a particular emphasis in this discussion on the democracy element. So I'll leave it there, Manish. I'll head back to the dressing room and try and prepare myself to the questions later.
Manish, I think you're muted.
I'm so sorry. Thank you, Excellency, for that big picture view, a very hopeful way of looking, very positive, constructive way of looking at this G11 concept as a grouping of democracies and crystallizing some sort of democratic consensus. We'll come to some of these questions as we go along with the rest of discussion. It's now my honor and pleasure to invite Ambassador Kanwal Sibal to speak. Let me introduce Ambassador Sibal. He's a former Foreign Secretary of India, and he has served as India's ambassador to major countries, France, Russia, Turkey, and Egypt. In 2017, he was conferred the Padma Shri Award by the President of India. Not many know about two things about him. One is that he loves writing poetry. He has a book of poems to his credit, probably more on the way. It's called Snowflakes of Time. While researching his resume, I figured out that he's also the first Grand Doctor of Philosophy in India. Ambassador Sibal, I would like you to focus on, essentially the G11 concept from the Indian perspective, so to say. What's in it for India? What are our strategic gains from joining such a grouping? Prime Minister Modi sounded quite positive, even enthusiastic about the idea. Some say that it's a counter-China club primarily. Is there a danger that we are getting sucked into some sort of China containment gang up? But more importantly, please first you should address what's in it for India, how we can leverage G11 to remold or mold a new world order. Over to you, Ambassador.
Well, firstly, in G7 or G8, China was not present. And therefore, if China remains absent from G10 or G11, it is nothing new. Despite that, over the years, China has become the second largest economy in the world. And the volume of commercial and trade investment between China and the G7 countries is huge. But that did not convince the G7 to include China for the reasons that the Australian High Commissioner has mentioned, that G7 free market democracies originally as a instability that this was causing. So therefore, I wouldn't bother too much about the China factor, and there's absolutely no reason. There's absolutely no reason why India should have any hesitation of joining this group in order not to send any so-called adverse signal to China. Even more importantly, if you come to the whole concept of the Indo-Pacific, or the Quad, or the Malabar exercises, or the India, US, Japan summits, or the logistic access arrangements that India has signed with the US, with Australia, with France, and possibly with Japan shortly. These are all steps or concepts that China can interpret as being directed against China, but we are there, and we are going ahead in this direction. So the fact that Trump has launched this concept of the G10 or G11, China has kept out, to my mind, is fairly irrelevant to the debate. That is one. The other, of course, is that this G10, G11 thing is still, as was rightly said, is something of a work in progress. The fact that Trump had announced it is itself problematic for some countries because of his record in handling foreign policy. And it is unrealistic of him to propose that this meeting be held in September on the margins of the UN General Assembly or before the US elections. I don't think there will be many buyers for this. People will want to wait for the US elections to take place and to see who wins. If Trump wins, of course, then this concept can be promoted further. If Biden wins, then we'll have to see how the next US government tries to shape this concept. But the big problem is Russia. Now, Trump has also indicated that he would like Russia to join, quite apart from the domestic controversy in the United States. It's more than a controversy. The polarization that has taken place around the relationship with Russia, this is a non-starter. Number one. Number two, Russia itself has reacted in a lukewarm fashion, where Putin has said that he would join only if Russia is treated with respect. Now, assuming for a moment that Russia joins, my own feeling is that if the conditions are right, and if there is really a genuine consensus about Russia joining, and here, just for a moment, I'll also mention the European factors. The Europeans will resist the inclusion of Russia until, of course, on Ukraine and on Crimea and other things, there is some forward movement to their satisfaction, because they have to handle not only public opinion in the major European countries, but the East European countries, Poland and the Baltic states would feel very strongly, and Ukraine will feel very strongly about this. But assuming for a moment that there is a consensus built and Russia joins, it'll be interesting, because I think Russia will join if the conditions were favorable. Then where is this whole issue about the China factor? So look at the Russia-China strategic ties; they're very deep. And if Russia joins, then clearly you have to then look at the whole G10, G11 in a very different light, and then you have to look at India's inclusion in that in relation to the China factor very differently, because the fact that India may join the grouping does not mean that India is going to join a Western alliance as such. And if Russia were to join, then the whole concern that somehow India is walking into a Western alliance, in inverted commas, would lose meaning, because Russia is not going to join any Western alliance. Now, if genuinely, as has been brought out by the Australian High Commissioner, there is a wide-ranging consensus, global consensus building up, that G7 or the G8 concept is of little relevance. In fact, the relevance of the G8 concept has already been exposed when the G20 was formed. It was clearly felt that G7, G8 was not good enough, and that you had to include other countries, and the G2 concept, the G2 grouping was established. So now, in the case of G10, G11, I think the Australian High Commissioner rightly pointed out that you bring the free market democracies together, but much more importantly, since a lot of action is in Asia and the Asia Pacific region, and China's biggest threat is in that region, then you have to get countries in this region who are concerned and who are the victims of Chinese expansionism and aggression, whether it is Japan or Australia. Well, Australia is not directly a victim of aggression as such, but then the manner in which China is treating Australia with all the sanctions and everything else, and India, there is a good reason for these countries to come together, and also to manage the whole concept of the Indo-Pacific and the freedom of navigation and freedom of overflights, not only in the Western Pacific, but freedom of navigation, protection of the sea lanes of communication in the Indian Ocean. You have to look ahead and see what China is planning. Not planning, actually, it is achieving that. It has got this China-Pakistan economic corridor, which gives them access to the Arabian Sea. They have this China-Myanmar economic corridor, which gives them access to the Bay of Bengal. So something which over centuries, at least the British tried to resist, Russia giving access to the warm waters of the Indian Ocean. Now, in changed circumstances, China is getting access to the warm waters of the Indian Ocean and creating security threats all around the littoral of the Indian Ocean countries. Now, if China, as was expected, had become a more open country, more democratic, and more willing to abide by international law, one might have viewed China's expansionism somewhat differently, but the kind of authoritarian state it has become, and its ambitions clearly known and expressed, and wanting to now replace the United States as the foremost global power by 2049, and establishing timelines for that. And clearly very hegemonic and hierarchical in its thinking, where it cannot tolerate the idea of any country, especially in Asia, being an obstacle, and hence the pressure on India and Ladakh and everything else. Now, in that situation, you have to see China's expansion on the Asian landmass and its expansion in the Indian Ocean as two sides of the same coin. And it is very worrisome. It'll be for the first time in history, that any country would dominate the Asian landmass and would see, if not domination, at least a very important strategic position in the Indian Ocean. And all these two, the position on the landmass and the position on the Indian Ocean, is tied together through these two economic corridors. So it is a challenge for all countries. For the time being, I find that our partners are concentrating more on the sea. But I think that's a mistake, because the sea and the landmass are connected. And the whole Belt and Road Initiative on land, the Eurasian corridor, is linked to the maritime Silk Route. So therefore, they should look at it in totality, and therefore look at India's problem on land with China in the same optic as they see the Chinese expansion in the Indian Ocean as a common threat. So these are some of the initial thoughts I have. But last point, that of course, if India joins the G10, G11, it will certainly mean, and we should welcome that, stronger ties with the West. But you know, the other question is of strategic autonomy. Do I have a minute or two? You have to unmute yourself. Yeah,
go ahead, Ambassador Sibal. Maybe a minute. You know, we come back. There are quite a few things which you have.
Okay, let me just speak a minute on the strategic autonomy, because this seems to be a bit of a bugbear for many of our Western friends, as somehow strategic autonomy means that we are not committed to a real relationship with the West, and we still have that bug of the non-alignment somewhere stuck in our DNA. But I put it to you, which is the country, and Ambassador Richard Verma is there, which is the country which protects, cherishes, and asserts its strategic autonomy the most in the world? Is the United States of America. China also protects its strategic autonomy, but leave aside China, it's a different system. But look at Europe. Even today, you look at the discourse of the French president and the statements he issues, he specifically refers to strategic autonomy, not only for France, but also for Europe. So strategic autonomy simply is a reflection of the power of a country. If you are like Japan, totally dependent for your defense on America, then you don't have strategic autonomy. Europe also is now festering a little bit because it doesn't have that much room for maneuver. I mean France, countries like France and others. So therefore, let's not look at strategic autonomy. Let's look at strategic autonomy in this light. A big country like India has to have strategic autonomy, but there's no contradiction between that and having a strong, mutually beneficial relationship with the West. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Sibal. That was, I think, well said. Strategic autonomy. I mean, there is a loose kind of criticism that joining G11 would, compromise our strategic autonomy, and will be seen to be part of the anti-China camp. I'm glad you have addressed those questions, and also the inclusion of Russia. We'll come back to that. I just we will pick up this theme. The ambassador of Denmark to India, he has remarked that do not forget that Russia has an Asian face, but also European one. So in geopolitics, Russia does not mean the same. Maybe when we talk again about Russia's inclusion, maybe one of the panelists should address that. Now I come to Ambassador Richard Verma. Thank you so much. Ambassador Verma is joining from New York. Ambassador Verma is Vice Chair and Partner at the influential the Asia Group, where he leads the firm's growth in South Asia. In India, he is known quite well. He is a very popular ambassador. He served as the US ambassador to India from 2014 to 2017, where he's credited for the historic deepening of bilateral ties. I think it was during his term that the term, the defining partnership of the 21st century, coined by President Barack Obama, gained currency. A leading expert on trade and diplomacy in Asia, Ambassador Verma brings 25 years of experience across senior levels of business, law, diplomacy, and the military. During his tenure as India's US ambassador, he oversaw several meetings between President Obama and Prime Minister Modi, leading to over 100 new initiatives and more than 40 government-to-government dialogues. I can go on, but let me pause here and let me put two questions to Ambassador Verma, which is, sir, that from your point of view, from what does it look like? What is in, the whole lot of conspiracy theories about G10, G11, and knowing President Trump's reputation for being a maverick, how can we trust that this idea is not just one of those things he tosses around? You see this idea being carried forward in case of a democratic victory in the November 2020 election. Does this idea enjoy bipartisan support among the political spectrum in the United States? How do you look at prospects of G10, G11 coming to fruition in the near future? Over to you, Ambassador Verma.
Yeah, Manish, thank you so much. It's really great to be with you. Great to see so many friends. Great to be with the High Commissioner from Australia. And I've worked closely with all of the former ambassadors here on the screen. I think, in fact, when I was a young congressional staffer, probably 20 plus years ago, Ambassador Sibal and I traveled around to Pennsylvania together. So we go back a long way. So it's great to see everybody. And I maybe want to expand what we're talking about here, because I think it would be limiting to just talk about the G7 to the G10 or G11, and all of us can argue about the pluses and minuses of whatever formation we come up with. I think the really important question is what all of you have been talking about for years, which is giving India a seat at the high table, giving India a seat in international institutions. And I was proud to be part of an administration, the first administration in US history that welcomed India's seat onto the permanent membership of the UN Security Council. I am sorry that we haven't made more progress towards that goal, but that's really what we're talking about. As we think about the international institutions that were developed after the post-war period, they were developed by the victors of World War II. Now, Ambassador Sibal calls, the United States the largest advocate for strategic autonomy. Yes, but we've also been, I think, the driving force in shaping the international system for good. I'm sure some would argue for bad over the last 70 years. The reality is we are withdrawing from that position. There is no question that the developments in the United States over the last 4 or 5 years, the election of Donald Trump, was about pulling the United States back. His theory of the case, which was supported by half of the country at least, was that the leadership role that the United States has played in the international system was not good for the United States, that the alliance structure, we were putting too much into it and getting little out of it in return. So 2 things have happened. We are withdrawing, and secondly, there are more players competing for power and interest in shaping that international system. And there are players that are competing that frankly are not friendly to the continued liberal democratic order. And we've already mentioned Russia, and we've mentioned China. And I think Ambassador Sibal was right to also talk about the closeness between Russia and China, which should give us some concern. Of course, in this environment, as he mentioned, a broader G7 that includes Russia is a non-starter. The fact that they would pay the bounty to Taliban and other extremist groups to kill American soldiers, the interference in our 2016 election, frankly, the continued interference, makes their participation in any new G7, G10, G11 a non-starter. And then we look at Russia and China. The leading provider of military equipment to China over the last 10 years has been Russia. In fighters, in the S-400 that India is purchasing, is also been purchased by the Chinese. So I think we have to look very carefully and be very concerned about what's happening between Russia and China. So look, I support very strongly, I think all of you know, India playing a more leading role. For many years, India did not want to play that role. It wasn't, you can be strategically autonomous, you can be non-aligned, but let's also be realistic. India was also focused on internal developments. That is changing. I am glad it's changing. It should change. And as we withdraw, if India steps up, frankly, that is a good development. Now, look, part of the kind of outdatedness of the G7 is obvious. When it was first founded, the group of 6 and then adding Canada, those members accounted for 70% of global GDP in the mid-1970s. But as you fast forward to today, that group of countries accounts for 40 to 50% of global GDP. So it is a huge difference, and it is a reason why the G20 has taken on more significance. It is reason why we've looked for other arrangements. It is the reason why India has looked at the Asian Development Bank. It's a reason why India wants to be a part of APEC. It's a reason why the Quad has grown in salience. We should be looking at all of these arrangements because I think the G7 is anachronistic. It is now outliving its kind of course. I'll just say to you, I would offer, and I don't say this enthusiastically or proudly, that you have to look at what President Trump offered with some degree of caution. This is a president that has not embraced international arrangements. In fact, under his leadership since taking office, President Trump has pulled the United States out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Paris Climate Accord, UNESCO, the UN Human Rights Council, the Iran Nuclear Agreement, the Open Skies and Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the New START Treaty with Russia, WTO's dispute settlement mechanism, the World Health Organization. I could go on and on. I think it was Fareed Zakaria who wrote recently that the biggest threat to the international system may be President Trump himself as he seeks to dismantle it in favor of what he thinks will be an advantage to the United States. I think that is sadly mistaken. And unfortunately, he is on a course to greatly divide the United States and weaken its position internationally, particularly most disturbing as he goes down this racial kind of white nationalism that he's embraced, which I think any country should think twice before it wants to embrace that kind of narrative coming out of Washington. And I'm sorry to have to report that that is the case. So, Manish, to answer your questions, obviously we want India to play a more leading role. It can be done. It should be done. I hope we're the architect of that. I believe mainstream Republicans and mainstream Democrats agree to that. It is bipartisan view in the United States. We're on a bit of an extreme departure these last 3.5 years in the U.S. Forgive us. we will return, I think, to a proper place in the next few months. That is my hope. I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Verma. I'm really grateful to you for putting that issue about India's bigger global role and India's permanent seat at the high table on the forefront of this debate. As I said in the beginning in my opening remarks, that this whole business about G7 to G11 is a metaphor for changing the world order, for forging a more inclusive world order. I'm great that maybe G7, G11, we don't know where it is going, but there is a very robust bipartisan consensus. As you say, if there is one thing the Democrats and Republicans agree on, it's a bigger role for India, and that's not going to change regardless of who is in power in Washington next year. Thank you so much. We'll come back to you for more questions. Now I come to Ambassador Anil Wadhwa. Ambassador Wadhwa served as Secretary in India's Ministry of External Affairs. His diplomatic career includes stints as India's ambassador to Poland and Lithuania, the Sultanate of Oman, the Kingdom of Thailand, and the Republic of Italy and San Marino. He is currently Distinguished Fellow, Vivekananda International Foundation. Not many people may know this. He also was involved with drawing up the Most Favored Nation Agreement between India and China way back in 1984. Ambassador Wadhwa, we have covered some major issues pertaining to this debate. Now, I would ask you to look at the potential role of the G10 or G11 in shaping geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific region. How will G11 complement plurilateral forums and groupings like the Quad and trilaterals such as India, US, Japan, trilateral, or India, Japan, Australia? We have quite a bit of alphabet soup here. Where does the G10, G11 figure in all this? Over to you, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Manish, and it's a pleasure to be on this webinar as well. Let me respond to your questions by making a few brief points. The first point I'd like to make is I think G11 is an idea whose time has come. I've noted very carefully what Ambassador Verma has said about President Trump. We look upon what he's saying as President of the United States here in India. So we've got to take it at face value and go along and respond to his initiatives as the President of the United States. Having said that, let me recall what he said about the bloc of G7 when he said it was outdated, and that is why it should include Russia, India, South Korea, and Australia. So while the non-inclusion of China in this is an indication of his clear intent, this has also been confirmed by the spokesperson in the White House, who said that China will be on the agenda at the summit. However, we should see this as an initiative which goes beyond China and is a grouping reflective of ideologically like-minded liberal democracies, which are also major economic powers in the Indo-Pacific. The second point I'd like to make is that there is still some misunderstanding in the general public about the nature of this invitation to a few countries beyond the G7. So while it is the prerogative of the G7 chair, in this case the United States, to issue guest invitations which reflects the priorities of the host and also the changing membership of the G7 or format on a permanent basis, of course, will require agreement of all the members. So already we've seen UK and Canada's opposition to the inclusion of Russia, which was mentioned before by Ambassador Sibal. And there are also Japan's reservations on South Korea. So this should be seen as of now as a one-off event. Our only hope in India, of course, will be that it will develop into a more permanent arrangement in the future. The third point I'd like to make is that the US initiative to expand the G7 meeting grouping against the background of rapid changes in the balance of power, especially in the Indo-Pacific, is due to the aggressive rise of China. And the US-China relationship has become decidedly adversarial, which has coincided with the COVID-19 outbreak originating in China, for which it is not prepared to take the responsibility or act as a reasonable state. Simultaneously, there's also been aggressive moves by China in the South China Sea vis-a-vis ASEAN countries like Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, in the East China Sea, and also vis-a-vis the seas around Taiwan and now on the border with India. So this has created new tensions in the Indo-Pacific region, which you have referred to, and that has resulted in a sort of pushback against Chinese actions. This is therefore a most appropriate time, in my view, for a grouping of major Western powers as well as ideologically aligned countries in Asia to come together to discuss, besides the China threat, ways and means to ensure a rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific, which will promote economic prosperity and stability in this region. Fourth point I'd like to make is that this is not the first time that other countries have been invited to G7 summits, and India itself has been a special invitee to several summits, the last one being Prime Minister Modi at the Biarritz summit in France. In previous summits, the G7 met separately and then in extended meetings with invitees. We are not clear about how the forthcoming summit will play out, but the sense is that it will be a G10 or G11 format, though there are still questions about decision making. If all countries are treated as co-equals in decision making, then the presence of the three major countries from the Indo-Pacific, and that is India, South Korea, and Australia, would certainly ensure that the outcome has a bearing on future policies affecting the Indo-Pacific. Fifth point I'd like to make is that if the grouping is expanded to include South Korea, India, and Australia, then in effect, the G10 or G11 will include all Quad or Quad Plus members. So this will bolster the US Indo-Pacific strategy because the additional countries being suggested include South Korea and Australia, both allies of the United States. There's India, Japan, and Australia who are already members of the Quad grouping, while South Korea has been taking part in the Quad Plus discussions on the COVID-19 crisis. Sixth point is that all the invitees, barring Russia, have advocated the idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific, peaceful settlement of disputes, which is based on rule of law, rather than through unilateral or coercive actions. They've also advocated freedom of navigation and overflights. So these principles also find support in the discussions in the Quad and in the trilateral groupings of India, Japan, Australia, US, Japan, Australia, and India, US, Japan. So given the proposed composition, the expansion of the G7 will certainly supplement and complement the agenda of the Quad and also the trilateral groupings. We should also note here that the US Senate has recently approved the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, and Australia has launched a 10-year defense plan now to meet security challenges in the Indo-Pacific. And these developments in the Indo-Pacific will, first of all, act to encourage the Quad into a more concrete agenda of action, and will also perhaps lead it to now take more concerted action. The Quad Plus, as we know, is already meeting regularly every week to coordinate issues related to COVID-19 and related issues. And now, Manish, the final point, the question on whether the presence of Japan and South Korea and India in the G11 will act as a bridge between the East and the West. So, as you know, the East and West construct is traditionally mentioned in the context of camps led by Russia and the United States. However, this is not the case in my view here. Asia per se has always been represented in the G7 by Japan. So this initiative to expand the G7 is just a reflection, as I mentioned before, of the reality of the present times when Asia has become the engine of global economic growth. And because of the political, military, and economic ascendance and assertiveness of China, which does not play by international rules, there is a need to bring on board like-minded liberal democracies committed to a rules-based international order. So India should and has welcomed this initiative, which also dovetails with its aspirations to become a permanent member of the UN Security Council, as the G7 has an important say in the economic and political power structure of the world. So Manish, I'll stop there now for now and get back to with answers to any questions. Thank you very much.
Ambassador Wadhwa, thank you for those illuminating remarks. I think you're right. Remains a work in progress. How G10, G11 will intersect with the Quad and the Quad Plus, and what role it can potentially play in sculpting an inclusive Indo-Pacific. Now we come to Ambassador Gautam Bambawale. Ambassador Gautam Bambawale is a former Indian ambassador to Bhutan, Pakistan, and China. He is currently Distinguished Professor at Symbiosis International University, Pune, where he's based these days. He headed the India Culture Center Berlin and was posted in Washington, D.C. during the India-US nuclear deal. He worked in Prime Minister's office, but most important, Ambassador Bambawale is one of the few Indian diplomats who know China so well. He has this rare insight into China these days. Ever since the crisis erupted, he's seen on all television platforms, is virtually writing for all major media organizations, publications. So I'm very thankful to him for finding time to be here at this important discussion. Gautam, if I may ask you, we'll focus on your opening remarks, which is this. I mean, other speakers have spoken a bit about this before, but maybe you'd like to dwell a little more in detail. How will the exclusion of China, the world's second largest economy, from G11 affect the efficacy and credibility of this thing? Isn't it better to have China inside the tent rather than outside it? And linked to that, of course, President Trump has said that this is all about, that the G11 is being formed or to have a discussion about the future of China. Again, do you think this will become a kind of a full-blown anti-China club or counter-China club? China has reacted very strongly to the very idea of G11. What's your take? Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Manish. And let me also say that it's a great pleasure to be with you this evening and with all the other panelists and the participants of this webinar. Let me, if you permit me, first let me start with India itself and reiterate and repeat a point which has been made by many of the other speakers. We have been arguing, especially in multilateral organizations, that these international multilateral organizations do not reflect the world of 2020. They reflect the world of 1945. So here, with the expansion of the G7 to the G10 or G11, is an opportunity for India to play a role in international politics and international economics. And I'm delighted that India has grabbed it with both hands. We should not worry too much about who is included or who is not included or who is excluded. As far as we are concerned, we should grab it with both hands. Let's hope it's a more permanent structure. As Ambassador Wadhwa rightly pointed out, at this point of time, it is not very clear or apparent. But let us hope that this becomes a permanent structure. And as one of the largest economies in the world, either the 5th, 6th, or 7th largest economy of the world, I think it is natural that India will be invited, along with other countries like Australia, South Korea, Russia, to this grouping. To come to the China question, of course, as you know, Manish, a few years ago, there was this big discussion about whether China is a responsible stakeholder in the international system. And I think the answer today in the summer of 2020 is very, very clear and very, very apparent to all of us that China is not merely, is she not a responsible stakeholder? She's actually what I can call an irresponsible stakeholder. And for all the reasons that previous speakers have already spoken about, the way they have reacted to calls for studies into the origin and spread of COVID-19, the way they have come out swinging aggressively through their wolf warrior diplomacy. This has also been seen in their aggressiveness in Hong Kong, where a new national security law has been implemented since yesterday, the 1st of July, 2020. They're doing the same thing in the Taiwan Straits. They continue to have a trade and technology war with the United States. And of course, they have now made what their intentions are on the India-China border very, very apparent. Let me take a little bit of time to dwell on this because this is a topical issue. Look, as far as India and China are concerned, it was very, very clear that one of the prerequisites for the rest of the India-China relationship to move ahead was maintenance of peace and tranquility in the India-China border areas. By making their military moves on the ground this summer, the Chinese have very clearly indicated, not only to India, but to everyone else across the world, that they do not desire a balanced, forward-looking relationship with India. So I would say that they have made the choice, and now India will definitely respond and react. We will reassess our China policy. We will recalibrate our China policy. And the banning of 59 apps is only the first step in what I see as a series of steps which are coming down the pipeline. I have argued, and I would hope that one of those measures will be the banning of Chinese firms from participating in India's 5G trials and rollout, like many other countries in the world have done on national security grounds and national security considerations. But that is only one. I hope that there will be a wider discussion in India about what measures to be taken. And I completely agree with the point that these measures, this reassessment has to be done in a calm, rational manner so that we come to conclusions and implement policy accordingly. If China is not included in this expanded G7, call it a G11, and I hope that Russia does participate in it. I think they have every reason from a geopolitical and geostrategic consideration to participate in the G11, in the expanded G7. But I think we should not worry too much about who is in the tent and who is not in the tent. We have all our partners with us, and we are going to expand our relationships and partnerships with these countries. In fact, I would argue that strategic autonomy, which means taking decisions in your national interest, demands that India strengthens its partnerships immeasurably and unambiguously with our partners, whether it's the US, whether it's Australia, whether it's Japan, and perhaps even with countries like South Korea and Indonesia. So I think I've answered your questions directly, frankly, and I think I'll stop there, Manish. You need to unmute yourself, Manish. We can't hear you.
This is my problem. I say thanks so much for being very clear and unambiguous in your articulation about this business of resetting India-China relations in the light of what is happening currently. Gautam, I have some questions for you. We are now beginning. We have done the first round, and in no particular order as the questions come along, I will be asking our esteemed panelists to respond to some of them. One of the things, this is a question from Shipra Tripathi of Bharat Forge. She says that there is something called, of course, the Five Eyes Alliance, and they have their own, way of functioning and partnership. How will this impact, a grouping like this will impact, the G10 or G11's capacity to deal with China, or China challenge or China threat, whichever way you put it. Over to you, Gautam.
Thank you, Manish. I'll be quick and direct in answering that question.
Right.
I think India should definitely step up its intelligence cooperation with all our strategic partners, which I've mentioned earlier, but which could also be members of the G11. Whether we participate in the Five Eyes and make it a Six Eyes grouping is something that will develop over time. I don't know if we even qualify to be a member of the Five Eye right now in 2020. But as we move ahead, as we build these stronger, unambiguous partnerships, I think time will tell whether we would become a part of a Six Eyes network or not. So I think this is something which will evolve over time, and we'll have to just wait and see. Thank you.
All right, thanks. I now turn to His Excellency High Commissioner of Australia to India. So there are quite a few questions from you. I'll club them together. But broadly speaking, the questions are around that, the kind of standoff India is having with China right now. Do you think if this grouping were to be formed, G10 or G11, and one of the members get into a similar sort of crisis-like situation with China, do you think the G10, G11 will be able to handle it more effectively? That's number one. And also, of course, you spoke briefly, you touched upon this in your opening remarks. But given this very sharp downslide in Australia's relations with China, do you think by joining G11 or G10, Australia will further alienate Beijing? Over to you, sir.
Well, to follow on from the last batsman, I'll be brief as well. I'd be surprised if a grouping of this sort took on a crisis management or mediation role. But I've always believed that one of India's great strengths is that it has friendly and warm relations with many of the world's influential players, and building these partnerships and friendships like the Australia-India Comprehensive Strategic Partnership can only become more important in the world going ahead. So I think the history of the G7 speaks for itself, and I don't see that changing given we've seen situations like this in the past affecting other countries. In relation to Australia, China and the grouping, Australia has and always will make decisions based on its own national interest. We are an active member of a variety of groupings and forums, and as a medium-sized, open, free trading democratic nation, we'll continue to work with friends and partners in supporting an open, rules-based international system. I often say that Australia's been a trading partner for more than 200 years. We have things to offer the world, our trading partners, that they want. It's up to people to make decisions whether they take those things or not. And whenever at various times we've had people move on from our products, we've simply gone looking for others.
Thank you. Before I move on to the next question, just want to tell our audience that you can tweet on the hashtag is India in G11. Now I turn to Ambassador Richard Verma. Basically, this whole debate G7, G11 is also about the reshuffling or restructuring or re-engineering of the world order. We're talking about the alphabet soup, and there are different, groupings on the table. How do you think G10, for example, G11, will impact the efficacy of G20? My question actually is, and which has been in a different manner being put together, asked by the audience as well, is that, 2008 global financial crisis gave birth to G20. 4 months, we are 4 months into this pandemic, and there's a lot of talk about a new world order. Do you think we need a new institution? Is G11, G10 the answer to the post-pandemic world?
Yeah, so Manish, I think there are two issues here. There's who and how will the international community work together to solve transnational problems? I think that's That's needed, it's required, and I think the pandemic has shown, unfortunately, that we failed to do it successfully. And again, I regret that the last meeting of the G7, the reason there was failure to come up with a comprehensive agreement was because of the United States. We couldn't agree to call it the Chinese flu. And so we walked away from solving other issues on export controls, on travel, on pharmaceuticals. So yes, we need an international mechanism to work together, because this will not be the only pandemic. We will have other transnational problems of migration, of terrorism, of climate change. And so we better get our act together from a global perspective. That means working with adversaries, that means working with allies. But the second thing that's important to me, again, I'll restate, I don't care whether it's G10, G11, G7, G20. What I care about are like-minded nations coming together who believe in certain principles, ideas, and values. And when I think about why the US and India, for example, have actually come closer together over the last 20 years in particular, it is based not so much on our trade, not so much on our defense exercises. It's based on the ideas that we actually hold dear together. And for me, those fall into three categories. One, we share common views on social justice and inclusivity. And you just go back through 200 years of great thinkers in both countries influencing each other. Secondly, we care about democracy. And again, we work together. I think about your founders coming to the United States, taking what aspects of the American Constitution they thought were relevant, but we both have strong democratic traditions. And third, and it's a more recent grouping of ideas, is on this notion of a free and open Indo-Pacific, where we solve disputes peacefully according to the rule of law, transparent. That grouping of countries is most important to me. And whatever that number is, I don't know. But if we can come together under a common set of ideas and values, that will be the glue that holds us together in this century, as opposed to what held us together in the last century. And you got to unmute again. Sorry, Manish.
I got to get it right. I'm so sorry. All right. I have a question now from Ragini Malhotra for Ambassador Bambawale, which is essentially, if I were to phrase it, that given the present India-China tensions and escalating rivalry, do you think G10 will help India to mobilize a global coalition to counter China's assertiveness and territorial ambitions? Do you think it'll become a pressure group like another bigger version of the Quad or something?
Thank you very much for that question. Let me start by saying that, we have to be very clear that on the ground, on the India-China border, we will have to fight alone, and we will have to fight China ourselves, as we have been doing over the past so many weeks now. So let's be very clear about that. But yes, in answer to the question about mobilizing international opinion, about leveraging strategic partnerships in trying to counter China's aggressiveness, in trying to counter China's assertiveness, yes, I think groupings like the G11 will prove to be useful, and we should use every one of those groupings, whether it is the G11, whether it is the Quad, whether it is the Quad Plus, or so many other possible groupings that could be utilized by us to stop China.
There's another question for you, which is by Ashok Sharma, a senior journalist. That, we have seen that in the aftermath of the India-China crisis, some countries have come out in support or expression of solidarity. Of course, the United States, France. Do you think there is a kind of, if I may put it like this, some kind of common position that can emerge or these countries which are going to be part of G11, there is a kind of common position shaping up on this issue?
No, I think there is a common position, a common understanding of China's increasing assertiveness, aggressiveness, the fact that it has come out of the COVID crisis, flailing and pushing in all directions. So there is a understanding of that. And I think eventually, for the bottom line is that there is a coalition of like-minded countries which could, if necessary, which could prevent China from doing what it intends to do.
Right. Thanks. Ambassador Sibal, this question is for you. You spoke about Russia question in your earlier previous remarks. Now, if India were to join G10, 11, what happens to the future of groupings like BRICS, RIC, SCO? So far we have been following what is some people say that a kind of foreign policy of multi-alignment, whereby we, become sort of expert at juggling the different balls there and, basically striking a balance between US and China in their big power rivalry. What happens to these? Do you think it will impact BRICS, for example? I can't hear you.
Can I make a few comments on some of the other things that was said before I answer your question?
Please go ahead. Yeah.
One is that this Five Eyes business, our intelligence cooperation with some of these countries is at a very inadequate functional level. It is there, it is increasing, but if you talk to our own people, they will say that it is not satisfactory. I don't think the level of trust is sufficiently high for them to actually make India a member of the Five Eyes thing. The intelligence agencies are very, very cautious by nature. Therefore, we should be realistic about this. What all we can hope is more intelligence sharing. That is one. The other is that let's be realistic. Has India taken a clear-cut position on issues, territorial issues or disputes that some of our partners have had with other countries? We have not. So therefore, why are we expecting that just because there is some tension, mounting tension in Ladakh, that those countries will take a position on territorial issues in our favor? They won't. They have. Do you think Korea can take a position like that? Even other countries, even Australia and others will be very hesitant to take a clear-cut position on these issues. Unless, of course, there is a wide-scale conflict, the real escalation, where then peace is endangered in the region. And then there will be efforts to calm it down. But again, the efforts would be to advise both sides to look for solutions through dialogue, hold their horses, don't escalate, that kind of advice that the UN Secretary General has already given, asking both countries not to allow this to build up and show restraint and stuff like that. There is no question, let's be very clear about that, let's not fool ourselves, that G10, G11 meeting can be used by us to develop a broad consensus in our favor with regard to the India-China problems in Ladakh. The other is that, the Russia will not come to the G10, G11 meeting as simply an invitee. We've had this precedent. India has participated. I myself participated in a grouping like that when the France was organizing this meeting. When they invite a whole lot of countries on the sidelines for discussions and this and that. Russia will not accept to come as an invitee because it was a full-fledged member of the G8 and it was thrown out from the G8 for the reasons we know. So It'll participate only if it is accepted as a full member, which means indirectly a restitution of their earlier status as a full member. We should keep that in mind. Thirdly, with regard to Ambassador Verma's 3 points, which he said with regard to what is now the basis of developing India-US ties, which is social justice, democracy, and free and open Indo-Pacific. I think this is fair enough, but I'm not 100% sure that this is enough, because a free and open Indo-Pacific only talks about the maritime dimension. And if India-US relationship has to develop and take on a much deeper content and a much broader basis, then territorial issues come in. Then Pakistan comes in. Then Afghanistan comes in. Land-based issues come in. In the free and Indo-Pacific, there may be some territorial issues in the Western Pacific, but there are no territorial issues with regard to the Indian Ocean. There are no contested spaces, no islands to reclaim, or things like that. And there is actually no problem about freedom of navigation and freedom of overflights. In fact, China should be very worried about freedom of navigation in the Indian Ocean, because their energy and trade lines of communication can be easily disrupted in the Indian Ocean, where for the moment and for the next 10 years, they will never have a presence strong enough to be able to protect those. So they remain vulnerable. And of course, there are the choke points, Malacca, and everything else. Now, with regard to the question you asked, look, we have been now participating in the, we are backing the Indo-Pacific concept, which has grown in credibility. In fact, the US has renamed its Pacific Command as the Indo-Pacific Command. The Quad, we raised it to ministerial level. I would recommend that we raise it also to the summit level, which probably will happen. The Quad Plus concept has been created in order to rope in more countries who are concerned about China's expansionist behavior. We've had all these exercises, Malabar exercises, all the summits that I mentioned earlier, trilateral summits and everything else, and the logistic arrangements and interoperability agreements with the United States and this and that. Now, this has not had any impact on either the RIC dialogue, or on BRICS, or on SCO. So why is it that simply if we attend G10 or G11, this will impact BRICS and SCO or RIC? No. In fact, we've had an RIC foreign ministers meeting, even when the Chinese are committing this aggression against us in Ladakh. So I don't think there's going to be any impact. Yes, what will happen is that the credibility of these groups in the eyes of the Indian public opinion would become less and less. You cannot have a situation where you talk peace or international governance or change of the international system in BRICS and SCO, and the SCO you try and keep the Western powers out. And when India and China are engaged in a conflict, so the stability of India-China ties is absolutely essential for grouping like BRICS and SCO or the RIC dialogue to retain credibility. India will not take the initiative to walk out of these because of the Russia factor. Russia was at the source of the creation of RIC and BRICS, and in a sense, co-partnering with China, they built the SCO. Russia very much wants us to be in, and Russia wants to give us this platform, quite apart from our bilateral ties and their desire to retain the intensity of these ties at a certain level, but also to be able to, what they had hoped for, stabilize India-China ties. They have not succeeded in this, but they still are trying, and I can share with you that we went in for this RIC dialogue. because of Russia's pressure. Because Russia would look upon it as a diplomatic defeat if it's something that they had conjured up as an alternative to the Western ideas of governance and everything else, and three great powers getting together, non-Western powers so-called, to see how the international system could be reshaped better and achieve better balance in international relations. If India were to walk out, it'll be a defeat for Russian diplomacy, and it'll impact our relations with Russia and other fields. And that's the reason why it was more a gesture to Russia than to anything else. And finally, look, despite everything else, which country, whether it is United States, Australia, or North Korea, or Japan, are going to cease to engage China? They're not going to. They're not going to. They will hedge against China, but they will not. They will not go into take decisions which will destroy that relationship. Similarly, India has to engage China, and in these platforms, even if we have strong reservations against China, these platforms are there for us also to keep a certain degree of engagement with China alive, and also in our own way to express our concerns at the manner in which China is conducting its foreign policy. So it will continue to be part of our overall balancing of ties, not in the sense that maintaining equidistance between the West and China, certainly not, but to maintain our engagement with China in a certain, in these plurilateral groups. And of course, let's admit the fact we have diplomatic relations with China, we have trade with China. So it's not as if the India-China relationship is going to collapse immediately. So it's a difficult game. It's a very complicated diplomatic game that we are playing, and other countries are playing. And let's see how it develops.
Right, Ambassador Sibal. Thanks for that very comprehensive and detailed response. I have several questions which I'll read out, and one is, very perceptive question by Sanusha Naidu, the researcher in Cape Town. She asked that, the whole system, when the entire international system is intrinsically flawed, then what difference does it make if you have another grouping, whether it's G10, G11, G12? This is important because this is somewhat reflects what Prime Minister Modi has been saying at some multilateral fora and what we've been talking about, which is the idea of reform multilateralism, not just upholding multilateralism, but reforming the way the system functions. And let me just mention here that, this 2021, come 2021 in India, will begin another inning in the UN Security Council as a non-permanent member. And we have been discussing this whole debate about reform of the international security architecture. Ambassador Wadhwa, how do you look at this, this critique that, which is this, that how do we reform this multilateralism? What is your idea? What is the way forward? Very quickly. We are coming to the end, so, maybe another 10, 15 minutes, a little this thing, but yeah, what is it? What is your take?
Yeah, so the whole question of UN reform has been debated for a number of years now in New York. It's also linked, as we all know, to the reform of the UN Security Council. But we are now at a point where the UN system as a whole has got into a situation where most of the multilateral bodies are not functioning properly. There are identified flaws which most member states are aware of. And the biggest flaw, one of the biggest flaws that we've seen in the case of WHO, for instance, is that countries now are increasingly turning voluntary aid to the multilateral organizations to their own advantage. And that is because the UN system does not receive the full contribution of member states on time. If they did, then that's the starting point. And then they don't depend on other countries to bail them out from time to time. When that happens, and that we've seen in many organizations, especially in the agricultural field, And in these organizations, obviously the agenda is then driven by the interests of the member states who actually are contributing and topping up the international organization. Within the UN in New York also, a similar system has developed. The UN is actually living from hand to mouth. They don't have enough to pay rents. They can't pay salaries beyond a few months. And when we come to that situation, and again in WTO, we've seen how the dispute settlement mechanism has been stopped because of not lack of recruitment. So we have to actually tackle these lacuna in the multilateral system. These are all known, and one by one, these have to be settled. Now, it's quite cynical, of course, to say that we should not have organizations or groupings because the UN is actually failing. But what alternative do we have? My point is that if we didn't have the United Nations as a system, then we'll be in total chaos. And at least let's try to fix that, and we can try and plug in the gaps. And these sort of groupings which emerge from time to time emerge because of a certain reason. And the reason why G7 is seeing proposal for expansion is also because we feel now that G7 is not enough, that something more needs to be done.
All right. Thanks. Also, there's a question. Actually, this question pertains to South China Sea, and there are two parts to it. One is to Gautam Bambawale. This is from Vietnam's ambassador to India, Famsan, His Excellency Famsan. So, it is that whether India will have a more clear-cut position on South China Sea as part of free and open Indo-Pacific after the Ladakh, what's happening in Ladakh. Do you think we'll be more vocal and assertive about South China Sea, the future, the wake of the Ladakh conflict? That's one. Excellency High Commissioner, Australia, your question to you is that Australia, how can Australia shape this? Australia has been a very proactive player. It's been championing freedom of navigation, very quite proactive on that front. How can G10, G11 really, shape up an inclusive architecture there and, counter this attempt to change status quo, as it were? Welcome first to you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. And thank you, Ambassador, for that excellent question. Let me again go back to basics and let me repeat a little bit of what I had said earlier to explain the point that I will make in answer to that question. One of the prerequisites for the India-China relationship to move forward is maintenance of peace and tranquility on the India-China border. The Chinese, by making their military moves, not just in eastern Ladakh, but across the entire 3,488 kilometers of the India-China line of actual control, have shown clearly that they're not interested in maintaining such peace and tranquility. And therefore, it is but natural that the rest of the relationship is going to be adversely and negatively impacted. I do not mean that we are going to go into a deep freeze like we did in the post-1962 period, but definitely it is not going to be the kind of relationship which emerged after Mr. Rajiv Gandhi, the then Prime Minister of India's visit to China in December of 1988. And that is a template which has continued right up till 2020. So to answer the question, I hope that, given the new kind of relationship that will come to exist between India and China, that we will take a much more clear-cut position on issues regarding the South China Sea, issues regarding the free and open Indo-Pacific, issues regarding the Quad, and issues regarding our strong partnerships with with countries who are part and parcel of this whole area.
Thank you. Excellency, over to you. Mike.
Manish, I think the most useful thing a G7 or an expanded G7 could do is simply to reinforce and work together to coordinate how we better apply existing long-standing rules and norms like the United Nations Convention around the Law of the Sea. I think in the same way as like-minded countries argued and ultimately succeeded in getting reform or review of the World Health Organization. I think that perhaps any grouping could be, including an expanded G7, could do that. In the meantime, can I say Australia will continue to call it out, but will continue to criticise interference with other countries' exploitation of that region, will continue to exercise their freedom of navigation through those features and their overflight of them.
All right. Thanks so much. There's a set of questions connected with this, the choice of countries which President Trump has made for, which is very arbitrary. Some would say, Australia, India, of course, South Korea, and Russia. We don't know where that debate will, how that debate will pan out. But some argue that what about countries like Indonesia? What about other emerging countries? What about Mexico? In this G10, 11, I'm not arguing, and I don't think this is the intention of the questioner, that it should be all inclusive. But what about Africa? There's no country from Africa. There is no country from Latin America. This will attract the charges of elitism, and to that extent, it may undermine its efficacy. On this very important question, I will first ask Ambassador Richard Verma to reflect on it, followed by His Excellency High Commissioner of Australia. Thank you.
Thanks, Manish. And I know we're over time, so I'll go very quickly here. Yeah. Look, I think as you start to add more countries, you very quickly end up closer to the G20, and as opposed to a G10 or a G11. So I actually agree with the question, because I think not having Argentina, Brazil, Indonesia, Mexico, South Africa, Turkey, I mean, these are all critical players, whether we call them middle powers or leading powers. I mean, to not have them as part of the conversation and to not have an important regional mix of players. So I think it's somewhat inexcusable not to have an African nation, not to have a Latin American nation. So I think any reform has to think about that kind of balance. But again, as you start to add the numbers, you very quickly end up at an existing structure, and that is the G20.
All right. Excellency, what's your take on this?
I agree with Ambassador Verma, but I'd simply say that countries like Indonesia and Vietnam and others have been incredibly important during the current crisis affecting the world. We've engaged with them, we've each engaged with them, and collectively engaged with them, and I think those things will continue to happen. But it is hard to justify some continents not getting a look in. But the bigger these organisations and forums get, perhaps they end up like other big institutions that fail to deliver common outcomes.
All right, thanks so much. We are actually exceeded our time limit, but just a couple of questions. I want to acknowledge people who have been stuck with us right till the end of discussion. There is a question by journalist Achilles Suman. He says that why the expansion of G7 is not being called a coalition of important democracies. The point is this, that this whole question of G7 or G10, whatever you call it, the very word G has a certain baggage to it. Isn't it time for another nomenclature? I want to end this on a more, we're talking about G10, G11, whatever. What about H10, health? The pandemic has put issues like connected to public health on the forefront of the global geopolitical agenda. What was a footnote in joint declarations has climbed right to the top. So just a final thought from all of you. We can go on with this. Your idea, as I said, reimagining a world order which is more inclusive. You want to sum it up? You want to add something more to it? Each of you, whoever wants to take this, we'll have to end this somewhere. So maybe Ambassador Sibal, Ambassador Verma, Gautam, all of you, if you can have your final summing up of this debate in 1 minute each, that would be great. Thanks.
Well, let me start. Firstly, I think Trump is focusing on China and the composition of G10, G11 Russia, of course, is doesn't quite fit into that framework. But Pompeo has again said that he's very keen that Russia participate. That has been a leitmotif of Trump ever since he became president. But there's a huge internal resistance. But leaving aside, maybe Russia's inclusion would also create some kind of a mistrust and some kind of a burgeoning rift between India and China, between China and Russia geostrategically, etc., etc. But the focus is on China, hence, therefore, Mexico, Latin America, or Africa and others, they have not been involved. Secondly, this multilateralism business. The United Nations is seized of this. In fact, this particular UNGA session is supposed to come out with a big report on multilateralism. This is an issue which is troubling everybody, and there is no easy answer. There's absolutely no easy answer, and I don't think beyond latitudes, the UNGA will come out with a report that will actually, once again, give impetus, give substance, give meaning to genuine multilateralism. For that, you need to reform the United Nations, and that, with the best of intentions, is not going to happen quickly enough. I applaud the fact that the United States, Australia, and others are supporting India's permanent membership. France does, UK does, China opposes. But this is not going to happen tomorrow. And the structure that had been built up will not be reformed so easily. So we have to live with this situation and perhaps then create what you might call broadly coalition of interests of like-minded countries based on certain values and some common understanding of the dangers ahead, especially posed by China, which is become a monster, and that monster needs to be contained. How to do that is not going to be easy because China's economic power has grown immensely and its financial resources are huge, and it is working to a plan. Now, how that can be opposed, how all our countries can come together to oppose that, it's an issue, but we are so cheery even of saying that we want to contain China. We sort of use all kinds of vocabulary and all kinds of concepts to do that. So it's a very difficult task that all of us are facing, but there is a challenge ahead and we must recognize it and cooperate accordingly. I'm speaking of the countries that are represented on this panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Bas. Ambassador Verma, you will have a quick summing of something which you'd like to mention.
Sure. Maybe 2 or 3 quick points. Let me just respond to Ambassador Sibal, who said earlier that the free and open Pacific was about kind of the sea only and the importance of the land. And I totally agree. I think we have to look beyond the sea. I will remind folks, and you all remember this, in 1962, in a very dangerous situation in South Asia, President Kennedy in the United States actually stepped up with 8 flights a day, 20,000 tons of ammunition and supplies. The 7th Fleet was deployed. We have a history of supporting our friends and partners, and we shouldn't forget that. Secondly, as we do need the global framework, but maybe I'll just end on how important the defining relationship of the 21st century is, and can the United States and India become the natural allies that various prime ministers have called upon us to be? And can we overcome those hesitations of history that Prime Minister Modi has talked about? I believe we can. And I believe if we do, and again, we ground it in our values and shared vision for a common future and common good, we actually, the two of us together with our friends like Australia, can really shape the international system in a very, very positive way.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador. Ambassador Anil Wadhwa, sir, you would like to add something? Very quickly, 1 minute.
Unmute.
Can you hear me? Some problem? Hello, can you hear me?
Anil, you need
I
to
think you can
unmute
hear me now.
yourself.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So I just want very quickly to sum up that point about the expansion of and inclusion of certain countries, and
Right.
we did mention Indonesia earlier, but I think I would tend to agree with Ambassador Verma, because there is a certain reason why the G7 has been expanded for this particular summit to G10 or 11. And focus, as Ambassador Sibal said, is on China. So therefore, we're looking at like-minded democracies in this particular instance. Now, if it comes to the future and we feel that this is a good format and there is a consensus on this point, then of course there are a number of other candidates. But we must be very clear in our mind that we don't want to replicate, another grouping which becomes like a G20. We already have a G20, and we should not create something which is closer to that number. Thank you.
Thanks. Gautam, a quick summing of anything?
Yeah, just to say that, the G11 will either continue as a grouping, depending on how efficient and if it's able to deliver the goods, both in the international economic sphere as well as the international political sphere. So it all depends. The proof of the pudding lies in the eating. Let's see how effective this grouping can become. Thank you.
Right. Thanks. Excellency, the last word goes to you. Yeah. I can't hear.
If I can just go to the issue that's been behind everything that's been discussed today, which is the underperforming or failure of multilateralism. I read a piece by a former Spanish foreign minister recently that said that this is, no one's tackling it because no leader has the will, the vision and the influence to do so. And I actually reflect on something that Ambassador Verma said, which is that India has shown an increasing willingness to step out and step up. And I actually think that in Prime Minister Modi, you may have someone who's prepared to finally do that.
Thanks so much. That's a very hopeful note. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, thank you so much. This has been a really rich and a very layered discussion. Let me, I will not even dare to summarize it because that will take a lot of time. Just to say a few things very quickly, which is this, that I think this panel, the sense of the conference is that the G10 or G11 is an idea whose time has come, that there is an imperative for reforming the global governance architecture, that India is the world's largest, most populous democracy, deserves a seat at the high table. And the idea, basically what the Trump said, this is an outdated group of countries. I mean, this is the point India has been belaboring for so many years, that the United States, that the global governance architecture is hopelessly outdated. It does not reflect the realities of the 21st century. So I think this debate, how the G11 or G10 will eventually shape up, we do not know right now. But what is very clear, that the pandemic and the developments around it have accelerated this, the process of reforming global governance architecture. I'll come back to, forgive me for being slightly, romantic in this despairing times of pandemic, but the whole idea of remolding the world to the heart's desire, which Rubaiyat spoke about, which Omar Khayyam spoke about, essentially that we need diplomacy with heart. We need diplomacy with the human face. We need compassionate diplomacy. We need compassionate politics. So let me just, Ambassador Richard Verma spoke about hesitations of history. The famous speech Prime Minister Modi made in the joint session of US Congress in 2016. Let me quote the poem, the last two lines of Walt Whitman, where he says, "The orchestra have sufficiently tuned their instrument. The baton has given the signal." And Modi ended that saying that, of course, there's a new symphony in play. So we'll very soon figure out whether this is a new symphony or whether this could become a source of discord. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, I thank from my heart all the speakers, very outstanding panel. Let me tell you the messages which I got, the high quality of discussion here. I mean, this is generated thoughts for, I guess, some, at least, books, papers, articles, and it's going to be, of course, a work in progress, and a lot will be written about it. Let me thank each of you, Excellency, High Commissioner of Australia to India, Ambassador Kanwal Sibal, Ambassador Richard Verma, Ambassador Gautam Bambawale, Ambassador Anil Wadhwa, all of you, and to a very fabulous audience, a very focused audience. By the way, we were live streaming it on YouTube and Facebook as well, so we had many more viewers. We will be publishing the proceedings of this conference, the next edition of our India and the World magazine, looking ahead. So thank you once again. I look forward to being in touch with all of you. Thanks once again.